The turkey was golden brown, the candles were flickering, and laughter filled the Thanksgiving dining room. My son-in-law tapped his glass and sneered, "You don't deserve to sit at this table, you're just the cook." Laughter rang out, and my daughter fell silent. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just smiled. A few days later, my son-in-law lost everything. Before we dive into this story, if you believe that karma always finds a way, please subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. The turkey was golden brown, the candles flickered soft light across the table, and for a moment, it almost felt like the old days. My wife, Margaret, sat across from me, smiling faintly, though I could see the fatigue in her eyes. Family gatherings had become more about appearances than about love, but still I carried the last tray of food, my hands trembling, not from the weight but from the memories pressing down on me. I am Antonio Collins, 70 years old, retired railroad worker, a man who spent his life building tracks so others could move forward. And for decades, I believe my only true achievement was raising my daughter Stephanie. From her first steps in the kitchen, her little hands tugging at my pant leg, to the day she graduated college in a gown I had worked overtime to afford, I was always there. I sacrificed promotions so I could be home. I sold my truck, my pride and joy, so she could have tuition paid on time. Every brick of her success was mortared with my sweat. Now, she sat at the head of the table beside her husband, Jason. He was a sharp-dressed man with a sharper tongue, always making sure people knew how important he was. He built his confidence on money that wasn't his, power that wasn't earned, and a last name that carried no history. And yet, Stephanie adored him. She laughed at his jokes, mirrored his arrogance, and slowly, piece by piece, the daughter I knew faded behind his shadow. Still, I cooked. I set the table. I carved the turkey with the same steady hands that once fixed rail lines in the dead of winter. I told myself family was worth it, that silence was better than conflict. Margaret whispered to me, "It's just one night, Tony. Let it pass." So I did, until Jason stood, tapping his glass. The room quieted. His voice sliced through the laughter. "Let's be honest," he sneered. "You don't deserve to sit at this table, you're just the cook." Laughter followed. My daughter's silence was louder than his words. I stood there, humiliated before 3 generations, the tray still warm in my hands. And yet I did not cry. I did not plead. I just smiled. I used to think marriage would anchor my daughter to kindness, that love would round off the sharp edges of any man. Then Jason arrived with polished shoes and a polished story, and my daughter, my Stephanie, began to speak a new language. Not words, but glances. Not gratitude, but comparison. He taught her the price of things, and she forgot the value. At first it was small. "Dad, Jason knows business, let him handle it." A hand on my shoulder, gentle, like you do with an old dog who still thinks he can run. Then came the whispered corrections, how I dressed, how I spoke, how the gravy could be thinner if I kept up with modern tastes. I laughed it off. Family ribbing, I told myself. Men like me have always swallowed pride with supper. But pride, once swallowed, becomes a stone. It sits, it sinks, and when you stop noticing it, it owns you. The gatherings changed. My seat slid from the middle to the end, then from the end to standing by the kitchen doorway. I kept serving plates, refills, the good stories, the bad jokes, while Jason collected nods for decisions he did not pay for. My victories wore his suit. My sacrifices signed his name. In private, he tried out new lines on me. "Old-timer, stay in your lane. You would not understand the numbers. Real leadership takes vision." Vision, funny word for a man who cannot see the hands that built his ladder. Margaret squeezed my fingers under the table. "Let it pass. Just let it pass." I nodded. For peace, for tradition, for the hope that my girl would turn her head and remember who taught her to stand. Then Thanksgiving sharpened the blade. His toast was not a mistake, it was a performance. He looked at each face, then at mine, and pressed the glass like a gavel. The room obeyed. Stephanie stared at her plate. No protest. No stop. Only the kind of silence that chooses a side. I felt the stone of pride at last. Heavy, yes, but not crushing. I set it down, and when I set it down, I found both of my hands again, steady enough to lift something far heavier than a turkey truth. The laughter around that table still hangs in my memory, sharp as shattered glass. Every chuckle, every smirk, every clink of crystal felt like nails being driven into the years I had given them. I stood there, a servant in my own bloodline, holding the tray as if it were a shield, though it offered me no protection. 3 generations looked on, some amused, some indifferent, none willing to speak. My nephews avoided my eyes, embarrassed, but not enough to stand for me. My brother-in-law simply sipped his wine, pretending it was nothing, and my daughter, my flesh and blood, sat frozen, the weight of her silence heavier than Jason's insult. Betrayal doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just looks away. The smell of rosemary and roasted turkey turned bitter in my throat. Hours of work, preparation, and tradition reduced to a cruel punchline. That dining room, once the heart of family, had become a stage for my humiliation. Jason played the role of king, and my daughter sat by his throne, content to let the performance continue. Margaret tugged at my sleeve, whispering my name, urging me to sit, to ignore, to endure, but I couldn't. My chair remained empty, an unspoken reminder of the respect stripped from me. I wasn't banished by force, I was erased by consent. I left the tray on the sideboard and excused myself without words. The conversations resumed, laughter swelling again as though nothing had happened. I walked down the hallway, each step echoing louder than their mirth, until I found myself in the quiet of the guest room. I closed the door and leaned against it, listening to my own breath. Steady, deliberate. That was the moment I understood. I had been feeding mouths that bit the very hand that cooked for them. I had given them warmth, shelter, sacrifice, and in return, they gave me laughter, soaked in cruelty. And in that quiet room, away from the glow of the candles and the noise of false family, a strange calmness washed over me. For the first time in years, I was not their provider, their servant, their afterthought. I was a man again, a man who had nothing left to lose and everything to take back. In the quiet after the laughter, I started tallying not dollars and cents, but years and pieces of myself. A ledger only a father keeps. Every line item paid in sweat. There was the winter I turned down the foreman job so I could make it home by dinner time. The railroad dangled more money, more status, but promotions steal hours a child needs. I chose spaghetti nights with Stephanie over overtime pay. I chose the sound of her homework pencil, scratching the table over the clank of steel in the yards. Sacrifice felt holy then. It still does, but holiness is a lonely currency when no one remembers how it was earned. There was the spring I sold my truck, the cherry red one I rebuilt bolt by bolt to cover tuition when the bursar said, "Final notice." I watched a stranger drive away in the only thing I had ever owned purely for myself. I told Stephanie it was just a car. Truth is, it was freedom on 4 wheels. I traded it for her future without a second thought. There was the summer I emptied my retirement to seed her cosmetics venture because banks smiled but would not lend. "You believe in me, Dad?" she asked, eyes shining. I did. I believed enough to unspool decades of savings in a single transfer. I believed enough to take night shifts again, knees aching, back barking so her dream would not arrive underfunded. And then the fall of her wedding, the tux I could not really afford, the venue I paid deposits on, the caterer who miscounted plates but not prices. I stood there a proud father while my wallet bled. I told myself it was joy. Maybe it was. Maybe it still is, wrapped in thorns. I do not list these to demand repayment. A father does not loan, a father gives. But giving ought to water a tree, not poison it. Somewhere along the way, the roots curled toward a different light, toward Jason's shine, and forgot the sun that raised them. So I sat on the edge of the guest bed and closed the ledger, not with anger, with clarity. The train of my life had reached a switch. One track led back to the kitchen, apron on, head bowed. The other, colder, straighter, led to truth. I have walked steel in winter storms. I know how to keep my balance. And I still hold something they have not counted, the thing I never bragged about because real power whispers. Let them finish their pie. Let them laugh. Tomorrow, I begin. That night, while the family clinked glasses and passed pie as if nothing had happened, I sat in the quiet guest room and let the weight settle. My humiliation was public, loud, unforgettable. But my resolve that was private, silent, and sharper than anything Jason could imagine. Margaret joined me later, her eyes red, her voice soft. "Tony, please, don't let this break you," she whispered. I took her hand, calloused, meeting calloused, and shook my head. "Break me? No, Maggie. They just reminded me who I am. I didn't pace. I didn't rage. I simply sat still, the way a rail line sits still, knowing trains will thunder across it but never shake its foundation. My whole life, I had given time, money, health, youth, and I wore those sacrifices quietly, like a uniform no one noticed. But tonight, in the cruelest way, They noticed Jason had stripped away my illusions, and Stephanie's silence had sealed the truth. I was not family to them. I was labor. I was convenience. I was the man who carved the turkey, but not the man worthy of the seat. And yet, I smiled, because I remembered what Jason did not know, what even Stephanie had forgotten. The signatures, the contracts, the shares, my name on the papers that kept his precious empire standing. Jason thought his throne was built on his charm and swagger, but in reality, its legs were mine. Margaret saw the curve of my mouth and frowned. "Why are you smiling, Tony?" she asked. I squeezed her hand. "Because they think tonight was the end of me. But it isn't. It's the beginning." I rose, slow but steady, the way I had always risen after long shifts in the freezing yards. My body may have been old, but my will had never rusted. As I looked out the window, the candles inside flickering against the glass, I felt something powerful return, something I had buried beneath years of sacrifice. Dignity. Unshakable, undeniable dignity. I would not beg for a seat at their table. Number. I would flip the whole table over, and when the dust settled, only truth would remain. Long before Jason, long before the humiliation at that table, there were nights when the cold cut through my jacket and the steel of the tracks sang under my boots. I was a railroad man. That life wasn't glamorous, no tailored suits, no boardroom applause, just long hours, heavy loads, and the bitter sting of snow on my face. But I endured it because at home, in a little house with peeling paint, a girl named Stephanie waited for me. When she was young, she'd press her face to the window, waiting for the sound of my boots on the porch. "Daddy's home," she'd shout, running to wrap herself around my legs before I even got through the door. Those were the nights that made the frost worth it. I would peel off my gloves, scoop her into my arms, and forget the ache in my back. Margaret would smile from the kitchen, a pot of stew on the stove, and for a moment the whole world fit inside that small house. I had chances to climb higher. The railroad offered promotions, more pay, more prestige, but those roles stole time. They meant missed dinners, missed birthdays, missed bedtimes, and I wasn't willing to trade my daughter's childhood for a bigger paycheck. So I stayed where I was, steady and dependable, while others climbed past me. People called me a fool for it. Maybe I was. But when I saw Stephanie's school project spread out on the table, when I heard her whisper, "Read it again, Daddy," as I told her bedtime stories, I knew I had chosen right. The men at work laughed about how I turned down the foreman position. "Collins, you'll die with a wrench in your hand," one of them said. Maybe so, but that wrench bought me time, the only currency that really matters to a child. I gave her every hour I could, even when my body begged for rest. And yet, sitting in that dining room decades later, I realized those hours, those sacrifices, had been forgotten. My silence at Thanksgiving was heavy, yes, but it was not empty. It carried the memory of every shift I worked, every night I stayed in the cold so my daughter could sleep in the warmth. They thought I was just the cook, but I knew the truth. I was the foundation they stood on, even as they pretended I was invisible. I can still see that truck in my mind, cherry red, polished chrome, engine that roared like a lion. It wasn't new, not by a long shot, but it was mine. Every bolt, every patch of rust I scraped off, every dent I hammered out with my own 2 hands, it carried my fingerprint. That truck was freedom. After a long shift on the rails, I'd drive with the windows down, radio humming, feeling like the world was bigger than the tracks I worked. But freedom is a luxury when bills pile high and tuition deadlines loom. Stephanie had been accepted into the university she dreamed of. I remember her running through the door, letter in hand, eyes wide with joy. "I did it, Dad," she shouted. I picked her up and spun her around, even though my back protested. That night, Margaret and I sat at the table doing math on scraps of paper, realizing we didn't have enough. Loans were denied, scholarships fell short. The only asset of value we had was sitting in the driveway. I placed the ad myself. A young man showed up, barely older than Stephanie, eager to take it for a spin. When he peeled out of the driveway, that engine I had tuned with love growled one last time, carrying away years of sweat and pride. Stephanie hugged me tight when I told her it was sold. "I'll pay you back someday," she promised. I told her no repayment was needed, that her success would be my return. But promises made in youth are fragile things. The truck disappeared from memory as she grew into new circles, new ambitions, new loves. For me, though, every time I passed an old cherry red pickup on the road, my chest ached. It wasn't regret, it was a reminder. A father's pride is often built on the ashes of his own joys. So when Jason called me just the cook, I thought of that truck, I thought of the freedom I traded for a daughter's future, and I wondered if she remembered, or if the roar of that engine had been drowned out by the sound of his sneer. Retirement was supposed to be my rest. I had worked the rails for decades, every shift carving years out of my body. My knees carried the ache of steel winters, my back the weight of endless freight. But through it all, I kept telling myself, one day, Antonio, you'll rest. One day, you'll sit on a porch swing with Margaret, watching the seasons turn without worrying about the clock. That dream lasted until Stephanie came to me with her big idea, a cosmetics company she wanted to build from scratch. She had the passion, the knowledge, and the charm, but what she didn't have was money. No bank would take a chance on her. She came to me with tears in her eyes, and when she asked, "Dad, do you believe in me?" there was never a doubt in my heart. I emptied my retirement account. Every dollar, every cent, every promise of comfort in my old age, I placed it in her hands. "Now go prove them wrong," I told her. And she did, at first. Orders came in, products shipped out, and Stephanie's name began to appear in local business journals. She called me her first investor, her silent partner. She told me she owed it all to me, and I believed her. But time changes more than markets. Somewhere between her first profits and her marriage to Jason, the gratitude faded. My role shifted from partner to background figure, from foundation to afterthought. The company that had my lifeblood woven into its books became Jason's talking point at parties, his badge of power. He bragged about their success, never once mentioning the retirement account that birthed it. Margaret asked me once, "Don't you wish you had kept some of it for us?" I shook my head. Parents don't invest in stocks, they invest in children. I thought my sacrifice would keep paying dividends in love and respect. But sitting at that Thanksgiving table, listening to laughter at my expense, I realized the account had been emptied twice, once at the bank and again in my hurt. I used to imagine walking my daughter down the aisle as one of the proudest moments of my life. And in some ways, it was. She looked radiant in her gown, a vision of grace and youth. My arm trembled as I handed her to Jason, but not from weakness, from the weight of knowing I was giving her away to a man I didn't trust. Even then, I sensed the hunger behind his smile. The bills for that wedding nearly broke us. Venue, catering, flowers, every item carried a price tag that mocked my modest pension. Jason's family flaunted wealth but offered little when it came to the costs. The unspoken expectation was that the father of the bride would handle it, and I did. I sold off keepsakes, worked odd jobs, and watched my savings vanish like water down a drain. Margaret worried, but I told her, "It's once in a lifetime. She deserves it all. Thanks for watching." I remember the night before the ceremony, sitting alone with the receipts spread across the kitchen table. My hands shook as I tried to balance numbers that refused to balance. But when I saw Stephanie's excitement, her faith in a fairy tale wedding, I swallowed the fear. A father's job, I thought, is to carry the burden so his child can dance free. The day came. Music swelled, guests applauded, cameras flashed. When Stephanie kissed Jason, I forced myself to believe it was worth every dollar, every sleepless night. I told myself I had given her the perfect beginning, but what I didn't know was that I had also funded the stage for my own humiliation. That marriage, cemented with my sacrifice, would one day host the scene where I was stripped of dignity in front of family. The man I had financed with my sweat would tap his glass and declare me unworthy. The wedding cost me more than money. It cost me the last illusion that love and sacrifice guaranteed loyalty. By the time the candles flickered at that Thanksgiving table, I finally understood. Debts of the heart are the only ones children forget to repay. It didn't happen overnight. Jason didn't humiliate me in public right away. No, he started small, quiet jabs, private smirks, little ways of reminding me that in his eyes I was beneath him. I should have seen it for what it was. But when a man loves his daughter, he convinces himself that swallowing pride is the same as keeping peace. The first time was at a family barbecue. He walked past me as I stood at the grill, leaned in close, and whispered, "Old man, make sure you don't burn the steaks. Real men handle the business, not the burgers." Then he walked off laughing, leaving me staring at the flames, the spatula heavy in my hand. Stephanie didn't hear it, or maybe she pretended not to. Another time, he caught me tinkering in the garage with a set of worn tools I'd kept since my railroad days. "Still playing with toys, huh?" he said, shaking his head. "You wouldn't understand the numbers. That's why men like me run companies." I bit my tongue, but inside I wanted to tell him that without men like me, men like him would have nothing to stand on. The insults were seeds, planted in the shadows, and like weeds, they grew. Soon I found myself moved from the head of the table to the far end. Then, eventually, out of it altogether, standing in the kitchen, apron tied, carving the meat, while Jason held court with stories of his success. Margaret noticed, of course. She'd glance at me with sorrow in her eyes, squeeze my hand under the tablecloth, whisper, "It's not worth it, Tony. Don't make a scene." And I didn't, because a father will accept being overlooked if it means his daughter smiles. But smiles built on silence are fragile things. Every joke Jason made, every dismissive shrug, every time Stephanie laughed along or said nothing, it chipped away at the foundation I had built. Respect eroded slowly, grain by grain, until one day there was nothing left but the echo of a man I used to be. By the time Jason tapped his glass that Thanksgiving, the cracks had already split wide open. The only surprise was how loudly they laughed when the house finally caved in. It started as a suggestion. "Dad, why don't you help with the food? You've always been so good at it," Stephanie said one holiday, her voice sweet but firm. I didn't argue. Cooking had always been my way of showing love, and if that's how I could be useful, then so be it. But slowly, that suggestion hardened into expectation. Year after year, I found myself spending more time in the kitchen than at the table. At first, I thought nothing of it after all. The family needed to eat, and I had 2 steady hands. But as the seasons changed, I realized I was no longer part of the gathering. I was service. I would peek out through the doorway, watching laughter ripple around the table while my chair sat empty. Jason at the head, Stephanie glowing at his side. Me, in the shadows, carving, serving, cleaning. There was one Thanksgiving when Margaret tried to insist. "Tony deserves to sit," she said firmly, standing in the doorway with a dish in her hands. Jason laughed, dismissing her with a wave. "He loves cooking. Let him do what he's good at." The words struck me harder than any blow. My wife looked back at me, torn between standing her ground and avoiding a scene. I shook my head, urging her to sit. Peace at the cost of dignity, that was the trade I kept making. The cousins, the uncles, even my own brothers, grew accustomed to the new order. They no longer looked for me at the table. They looked for the man with the carving knife, the apron, the silence. I became invisible in plain sight. Margaret would steal moments with me in the kitchen, pressing her hand against mine. "One day they'll see," she whispered. I nodded, though I didn't believe it. Respect, once surrendered, rarely returns. And so the kitchen became my exile. I wore it like armor, telling myself it was love. But deep inside, I felt the sting each time Jason raised his glass and toast, each time Stephanie leaned into him as if he were the foundation of her world. They saw me as a servant. They forgot I was the man who had built the very table they laughed around. By the time that fateful Thanksgiving arrived, I was no longer surprised when Jason tapped his glass. I was only surprised at how much it still managed to cut. When I look back on the years, I see a pattern as clear as the steel lines I once worked. Give, sacrifice, repeat. That was my rhythm. I gave when I had little. I gave when I had nothing left. And still they wanted more. I gave my youth to the rails so my daughter could have security. I gave my truck so she could walk onto a college campus without shame. I gave my retirement so she could build a dream with her name on it. I gave my savings so she could stand in white lace before her friends, smiling without worry of cost. Every time life demanded a toll, I paid it. Not with hesitation, but with pride. Because that's what fathers do. But here's the truth no one tells you. When giving becomes expected, it stops being love and starts being servitude. Jason never asked with gratitude. Stephanie stopped asking at all. They simply assumed, that's what stung the most, that my sacrifices were no longer seen as choices but as obligations. A bottomless well they could draw from without so much as a thank you. I remember once, years before Jason, Stephanie hugged me and whispered, "Dad, you're my hero." That memory is burned into me like the warmth of a coal fire on a freezing night. At the table, when Jason called me just the cook, I searched her face for even a flicker of that old love. But there was nothing, just silence, complicit and cold. And so I sat in the dark that Thanksgiving night, the echoes of laughter still rattling in my chest, and repeated the words in my head. I gave, I gave, I gave. And still, they wanted more. But I am not a well. I am a man. And when a man sees his sacrifices twisted into shackles, something inside him shifts. That night, something shifted in me. The giver became the keeper. The servant became the judge. They thought they had taken everything. What they didn't know was that I had one thing left, hidden in plain sight, and it was enough to change everything. After that night, while the rest of them went on posting pictures of their perfect Thanksgiving on social media, I slipped into the study at home and pulled down an old box from the closet. It was heavy with years' contracts, receipts, faded bank statements. Margaret watched me lay them out across the desk, her face etched with worry. "Tony, why are you digging up the past?" she asked softly. "Because," I told her, "the past is the only thing Jason can't rewrite." I ran my fingers over the brittle pages, each one a marker of sacrifice. Tuition checks written in my shaky hand, loan agreements I had signed as guarantor. But then, beneath a pile of letters, I found what I was really looking for. The shareholder agreements from the early days of Stephanie's Cosmetics Company. My name, written bold on the line, not as donor, but as owner. It all came rushing back. Stephanie had begged me for help, tears in her eyes, certain her dream would die without seed money. I didn't just hand her cash. I invested. We drew up papers. My retirement went in, and in return, I held a controlling share. "It's only on paper, Dad." She'd laughed back then. "You'll never need to use it." I had nodded, because fathers don't imagine cashing in on their daughters. But now those papers looked less like tokens of love and more like weapons. Jason strutted around, bragging about his empire, when the truth was, every board vote, every business decision technically still ran through me. I sat back in my chair, the crackle of the fire behind me, the weight of revelation pressing down. I hadn't just given everything away. No, I had been smarter than that, even in my sacrifice. Buried beneath years of silence was power. Real power. The kind Jason had no idea existed. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. Margaret touched my shoulder gently. "Tony, what are you thinking?" I folded the papers, slid them into a folder, and smiled. "I'm thinking it's time Jason learns who really owns his throne." Jason wore confidence like a suit tailored, expensive, and loud. He thrived on the admiration of others, on the illusion that he was a self-made man. But as I sat with those papers spread before me, I saw through his act. His crown wasn't gold. It was paper, and my name was inked on every fold of it. I remembered the night Stephanie and I signed those documents. She had been so full of hope, her hands trembling as she slid the papers across the table. "Dad, this makes it official. You're part of this with me," she said. I laughed and told her that no contract could make me more invested in her than I already was. I only signed because she insisted. At the time, I thought it was symbolic, just a daughter wanting to make her father feel important. But the law doesn't deal in symbols. The law deals in signatures, and mine was worth more than Jason's entire image. I dug deeper into the box and found minutes from early board meetings. My name, listed as majority shareholder. My rights, spelled out in black and white. I had forgotten how thorough our lawyer had been, how he made sure every detail was airtight. Jason had built his throne on a foundation he never bothered to check. Too arrogant to imagine the old man in the kitchen could be the one holding the deed to his empire. Margaret watched me, worry turning to curiosity. "So, what does this mean?" she asked. "It means," I said slowly, "that Jason has been parading around on land that isn't even his, and he doesn't know it yet." The weight of humiliation I'd carried for years began to shift. It didn't vanish, not yet, but it was no longer just pain. It was leverage. Every insult, every smirk, every stolen seat at the table, they were debts. And now I had the ledger in my hands. Jason thought he had buried me in the kitchen, but I was about to remind him that the man behind the stove once laid the tracks his whole train was running on. Once I knew I still held the power, I began to look at Jason differently. The arrogance, the loud laughter, the way he ordered wine at restaurants, as if the whole room needed to know he could afford it. All of it felt thinner now, like paint over rotting wood. And when I started paying closer attention, I noticed the cracks. Rumors traveled faster than trains. An unpaid vendor here, a delayed shipment there, quiet whispers about debts piling up under Jason's management. He was good at bluffing, keeping the illusion alive with expensive suits and flashy cars, but I knew the language of men stretched thin. I'd seen it in coworkers who gambled their paychecks before rent was due, the forced smile, the quick temper, the constant need to look bigger than they were. I called in a favor from an old friend who still worked at the bank. It didn't take long before I had confirmation. Jason had been taking loans against the company, stacking risk on top of risk, betting that image would keep the money flowing. He wasn't building an empire. He was juggling torches over a pool of gasoline. I sat at the desk, papers spread out again, and let the truth sink in. Stephanie's dream, the one I had emptied my retirement for, was balanced on a knife's edge because Jason treated it like his personal stage. He used the company not as a business, but as a prop, and every decision he made, without consulting me, without even acknowledging my role, put it closer to collapse. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching me. "Tony," she said, "this could destroy them." I shook my head. "No, Maggie, this could save the company. But it will destroy Jason." And for the first time, I didn't flinch at the thought. For years, I had feared becoming the villain in my daughter's story. But Jason had already written me out of it, cast me as the cook in the background. Now, I was ready to take the pen back. The facade was crumbling. All I had to do was give it one final push. I had lived most of my life trusting in hard work, not lawyers. But papers don't lie, and papers are what Jason had ignored. So one morning, I took the folder of contracts and shareholder agreements to a man who had seen me through rough times before, Mr. Harris, the lawyer who drafted the documents when Stephanie first started her company. He was older now, gray at the temples, but sharp as ever. He read through the pages slowly, nodding here, underlining there. Finally, he looked up over his glasses and said, "Antonio, you realize what you have here, don't you?" I shrugged, playing dumb. "A stack of paper?" He tapped the agreement with his pen. "Number control. You're the majority shareholder. Legally, you've had the final say all along. Jason can play CEO, but every move he makes is on your goodwill. If you revoke it, he's finished. I will not with the japper." The words struck me like a hammer, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed what I had begun to suspect. All these years, I had thought of myself as powerless, banished to the kitchen while Jason held court. But here was proof that I had been holding the real gavel the entire time. "What about Stephanie?" I asked quietly. "She signed these too." Mr. Harris folded his hands. "She's still a shareholder, yes. But she gave you control. You're the one with the votes that matter. Jason has nothing without you." I sat back in the chair, the leather creaking beneath me, and let that truth settle. Jason's empire, his pride, his arrogance, it all balanced on papers he had never read. A paper crown, as fragile as ash in the wind. Mr. Harris leaned forward. "If you want to act, Antonio, you can. Legally. Cleanly. There's no revenge in this. It's simply taking back what's already yours." That was no thanks for watching. I left his office with the folder pressed against my chest, the weight of it both heavy and liberating. For years, they had laughed at me. Now, with the law on my side, I carried the silence of a storm waiting to break. Jason had no idea the old man in the kitchen was also the executioner at his table. Once I knew the law was on my side, the next step was patience. Quiet, deliberate patience. Jason's arrogance made him sloppy, and sloppy men always leave trails. I started collecting them one by one. First came the unpaid invoices. Vendors who had once sung the company's praises now whispered about delayed payments. Excuses piled high as the products Jason promised but never delivered on time. I visited one myself, an old supplier who remembered me from the early days. "Antonio," he said, shaking his head, "your daughter's husband is running this place like a casino. He takes credit, but he doesn't pay. Not like you, never like you." He handed me a copy of the overdue bill, more out of respect than necessity. I folded it carefully and slid it into my folder. Then there were the loans. My friend at the bank confirmed what I already suspected. Jason had leveraged the company like a gambler mortgaging his house for another hand of cards. Each loan carried higher interest, each one secured against the same fragile reputation he polished in public. I obtained copies of those documents, each signature a nail in the coffin he had built for himself. I dug deeper. Emails, board minutes, careless messages Jason had sent bragging about shortcuts he'd taken, corners he'd cut. He was reckless, leaving behind digital fingerprints of arrogance. Every file I printed, every email I saved, went into the folder that was beginning to bulge with his undoing. Margaret noticed the growing pile. "Tony," she said, "what are you going to do with all of this?" I looked at her, calm and steady. "I'm not going to shout, Maggie. I'm not going to beg for respect at their table. I'm going to let the truth speak for me." Each night, I sat in the study, the lamp casting shadows over the papers. Jason thought his world was untouchable, but I held the proof it was made of glass, and soon, with one quiet motion, I would let it shatter. It's a funny thing about power, people only respect it while it shines. The moment the light flickers, they scatter like shadows. I didn't even have to move yet. Jason's own missteps were dimming the glow, and I watched as the crowd around him began to shift. At parties, I noticed the difference first. The same men who used to laugh at his jokes a little too loudly now glanced at their watches instead. Business partners who once raised glasses to his vision now raised eyebrows when he wasn't looking. Jason, too consumed with basking in his own reflection, never saw the change. But I did. I'd lived long enough to know when loyalty was starting to crack. One afternoon, I got a call from a distributor I had known since Stephanie's early days. He spoke carefully, testing the waters. "Antonio, do you still have influence there?" I let the silence hang before answering. "I might." His sigh was heavy with relief. "Then maybe you should know Jason's late again. 3 shipments unpaid. People are nervous." I tucked that conversation away like another card in a growing hand. Jason thought he was the dealer, but he didn't realize the deck was no longer his. Even Stephanie seemed uneasy. I caught it in her eyes during dinners, the way she avoided questions about the company, the way she fiddled with her ring when Jason bragged too much. She hadn't spoken against him yet, but doubt had begun to seep in. She too was beginning to see the cracks. Margaret noticed the changes as well. "They're turning on him," she whispered one night as we lay in bed. I nodded. "They will, because men like Jason build houses of mirrors, and when the first pane breaks, everyone realizes there was never a house at all." The allies who once cheered him were already pulling back. They smelled the storm before Jason even felt the rain, and I was the one holding the thunder in my hands, waiting for the right moment to let it strike. By the time I finished gathering, the folder was so thick it barely closed. Contracts, invoices, emails, board minutes, all of it stacked like bricks in a wall Jason couldn't climb. I placed it on the desk and just stared at it for a while, the weight of it pressing into the wood. Margaret came in, carrying tea, her eyes following mine to the folder. "Tony," she said, setting the cup down gently, "is that enough?" I nodded slowly. "More than enough. This isn't just evidence, Maggie. It's leverage. It's the truth, dressed in armor." I opened it one last time, leafing through the pages. Each document told a story of his arrogance, his neglect, his fraud. But together, they told something bigger, that Jason was not the king he pretended to be. He was a squatter in a house I had built, and the deed had always been in my name. I thought about the years I had been silent, the insults I had endured, the laughter I had swallowed. Every humiliation was preserved here, not in memory alone, but in signatures and seals. It was almost poetic. He had mocked me as just the cook, but in truth, I was the architect of his downfall, and he had handed me the tools himself. Margaret touched my shoulder. "When will you use it?" "Soon," I told her, but not in anger. Anger clouds the aim. This needs to be clean, deliberate, undeniable. I slid the folder into the drawer, turned the key, and pocketed it. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. Jason had thought he'd humiliated me into silence. What he didn't realize was that silence is not weakness, it's preparation. The table he had stolen from me was nothing compared to the empire he was about to lose. And when the moment came, I wouldn't shout, I wouldn't argue, I would simply open this folder, and Jason's world would collapse with the sound of turning pages. The folder sat on my desk for 2 nights, heavy as a stone I could not yet throw. I waited, not out of hesitation, but out of discipline. Timing mattered. A hammer swung too early bends the nail instead of driving it through. On the 3rd morning, I called Mr. Harris. He answered with the same steady voice I remembered from years back. "Antonio," I wondered, when I'd hear from you again. "I'm ready," I said simply. No speeches, no hesitation. Just 2 words that carried the weight of decades. We met in his office that afternoon. The walls were lined with law books, the air smelling faintly of leather and dust. I laid the folder on his desk, and he opened it with the care of a man handling dynamite. Page by page, he nodded, occasionally raising an eyebrow at Jason's recklessness. When he finished, he closed it and looked at me long and hard. "You understand," he said, "that you don't need to fight dirty. Legally, this is yours. You hold the majority. You can call a meeting, replace the board, oust him cleanly. The law will be your sword." For the first time, I felt the storm inside me calm. This wasn't vengeance in the dark. It wasn't backroom scheming. It was justice, carved into contracts and sealed with ink years before Jason ever sneered at me. He had thought me powerless, but the law had been my silent ally all along. "What do we do first?" I asked. Harris leaned back, fingers steepled. "We draft the notice. Call the board. The moment you sign, Jason's throne begins to crack." I exhaled slowly, the decision final in my chest. Margaret's words echoed in my ears. "Don't let this break you, Tony." No, I thought. This won't break me. This will free me. When I left the office, folder under my arm, the world outside felt different. The air was sharper, the ground steadier. For the first time in years, I wasn't just surviving humiliation. I was moving toward something, toward justice. Jason had thrown me out of the dining room. Now, I was walking into his boardroom, with the law at my back. The boardroom smelled of polish and pride. Jason sat at the head of the long oak table, suit pressed, tie sharp, smile wide. He was in his element, surrounded by people he believed to be his loyal audience. I entered quietly, folder in hand, my presence barely acknowledged at first. To Jason, I was still the old man who carved turkeys, not the man about to carve out his throne. The meeting began with his usual theatrics, boasting about growth, waving around charts that hid more than they revealed, making promises the numbers could never back. He loved the performance, the claps, the nods, the illusion that he was indispensable. But when he paused for breath, I slid the folder onto the table and pushed it forward. "What's this?" he asked, his smirk twitching at the edges. "Reality," I said calmly. The board members leaned in as Jason opened the folder. Page after page, their faces shifted from curiosity to unease, then to quiet alarm. Overdue invoices, reckless loans, records of mismanagement, all signed under his watch. I had highlighted every line, every flaw, every debt he had hidden beneath his polish. One man cleared his throat. "Jason, is this accurate?" Jason stammered, tried to laugh it off, but the room was no longer his stage. The smirks that once echoed his own were gone. Eyes turned from him to me. They had always assumed I was a relic, a background figure. Now they saw the truth. The majority shareholder, the man whose name was etched into every binding agreement. "Gentlemen," I said quietly, "this company was built with sacrifice, not swagger, and I won't see it ruined by arrogance." Jason's face reddened, his charm faltering. He tried to speak, but his voice cracked. For the first time, the boardroom wasn't laughing with him, it was watching him sink. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The papers did the shouting for me, and with every page turned, Jason's empire bled out on the table, exposed for what it truly was. Hollow, fragile, already collapsing. The king had been unmasked, and his court was already turning away. It didn't take long after that meeting for the whispers to become thunder. The same men who once raised glasses to Jason's success now raised questions behind closed doors. I had seen it before in the rail yards, in unions, in small towns where reputations ruled. Loyalty built on bluster vanishes the moment it stops being profitable. Within a week, partners began pulling out of deals. Vendors tightened their terms, demanding cash up front. A few even called me directly, their tone cautious but respectful. "Mr. Collins," one said, "we always knew you were behind this company. If you're taking a more active role, we'll stay, but not with Jason in charge." The walls around him began to close in. Jason strutted less, smiled less. His phone calls grew louder, sharper, desperate. I watched from the sidelines, silent, as his allies slipped through his fingers one by one. The board, once eager to nod at his speeches, now leaned toward me when decisions were discussed. They wanted stability, not spectacle. Even at home, the cracks spread. Stephanie came by one evening, her face pale. "Dad, what's happening?" Jason's been furious. He says people are abandoning him. I looked at her carefully, measuring my words. "People don't abandon truth, Stephanie. They abandon lies when they finally see through them." She didn't answer. She just lowered her eyes, the same way she had at the Thanksgiving table, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, uncertain. Margaret sat with me that night, her hand over mine. "It's happening, Tony. They're leaving him." I nodded, though I didn't smile. This wasn't triumph, it was inevitability. Men like Jason build empires of glass. The moment a stone is thrown, the flock scatters to avoid being cut. And I hadn't even thrown my stone yet. All I had done was open the folder, let the light in. The real blow, the one that would end him completely, was still waiting. Jason thought he was drowning because of others. He hadn't realized yet that I was the tide pulling out beneath him. Jason had built his empire the way a child builds castles in the sand-high walls, wide towers, all for show. But the tide was coming in, and with each passing day, more of it washed away. The first public crack came in the papers. A business column ran a story about late payments and stalled shipments. Nothing damning at first, just a hint of smoke. Jason brushed it off, called it jealous competitors spreading lies. But then a second article followed this one with names, numbers, and documents that looked very familiar. The folder I'd handed the board was beginning to leak into the world. Soon, clients who once begged for his time started canceling contracts. Investors stopped returning his calls. His phone, once a weapon he used to command rooms, became a leash that dragged him deeper into panic. He shouted more, drank more, and Stephanie's smile grew thinner by the day. I watched it all unfold without lifting a finger. There was no need. Truth has a way of traveling faster than lies when the dam finally breaks. At dinners, I sat quietly while Jason tried to keep up appearances, his voice brittle as glass. He still called himself the face of the company, but faces crack when the foundation crumbles. One evening, Margaret leaned toward me and whispered, "He's unraveling." I only nodded. I had learned on the rails that when a train jumps the track, you don't have to push, it destroys itself with its own momentum. Jason began losing his temper in meetings. Partners walked out. Friends stopped answering invitations. Even his own family, the ones who had laughed at his cruel toast on Thanksgiving, grew distant, unwilling to be associated with the sinking ship. The room that once echoed with applause now echoed with silence. And still, he didn't see me. He didn't realize I was the tide. He thought he was fighting shadows, competitors, bad luck. He never looked toward the man he had mocked as just the cook, but soon he would, because the real collapse wasn't in the papers, or the partners, or the whispers. It was in the transfer I was about to make the move that would strip him bare overnight. In the end, it all came down to a signature. Strange how something so small, ink on paper, could topple a man who thought himself untouchable. I met Mr. Harris again in his office, the folder open between us. He slid a new set of documents across the desk, his tone measured. "Antonio, once you sign, Jason's control is finished. The shares will be transferred to the partner you named. He'll have nothing left to stand on." I picked up the pen, feeling its weight in my hand. My mind flickered through years of sacrifice. Nights on the rails, the cherry-red truck driving away, retirement drained for a dream, the wedding bills stacked high. Every moment had led here. Every humiliation, every silence, every sneer Jason had thrown my way. This wasn't vengeance, it was the ledger finally balancing. Margaret sat beside me, her hand resting over mine. "Are you sure, Tony?" she asked softly. I looked at her, steady. "I've never been more sure." That meant her, and with one motion, I signed. The papers slid back across the desk, stamped, sealed, final. Jason Miller's empire no longer belonged to him. The throne he had mocked me from had vanished beneath him overnight. When I left the office, the city felt different. The air carried a bite of winter, sharp and clean. People hurried past me with their own worries, unaware that a kingdom had just changed hands in a quiet room. I didn't need applause. I didn't need recognition. The satisfaction was in the silence, the kind that comes when justice finally tips its scale. That evening, I sat in my chair at home, the same one where I had once nursed tired bones after long shifts, and felt lighter than I had in years. Margaret brewed tea, her eyes searching mine. "Do you feel at peace now?" she asked. "Not yet," I admitted. "Peace comes when he understands, when he looks at me and finally sees who held the crown all along." The transfer was done. Jason just didn't know it yet, and soon he would. Jason's downfall came faster than even I expected. One morning he was strutting into meetings, barking orders, boasting about deals. By the next, he was locked out of accounts, his calls unanswered, his name already whispered like a warning. Power is a fragile thing. It evaporates the moment people realize you don't hold it anymore. When the news reached him that his authority was gone, he stormed into the boardroom, eyes wild, tie askew. "Who did this?" he demanded, slamming his fist on the table. The board members shifted uncomfortably, their silence louder than any answer. Finally, one of them cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Collins exercised his rights." Jason's head snapped toward me. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked small. The swagger drained out of him, replaced by disbelief. "You," he spat, as though the word itself was poison. "You did this?" I didn't raise my voice. I simply nodded. It was never yours to begin with. He sputtered, tried to argue, to bargain. We can work something out, Antonio. Think about Stephanie, think about the family. Don't do this. The irony of him begging for family after humiliating me in front of 3 generations nearly made me laugh. But I didn't. This wasn't about pettiness. This was about truth. You should have thought about family, I said evenly, when you told me I wasn't part of mine. One of were Sears and the setter with 3-1 to mand. Our many welve. Jason's face twisted, his charm finally shattered. He slumped into his chair, the weight of defeat crushing him. The board didn't look at him anymore. They looked at me. The old man, the one he'd called the cook. He muttered something, an appeal, a curse. I couldn't tell which, but I didn't answer. I left him there, a beggar at a throne that had never truly been his. Outside, the winter wind stung my face, but it felt like clarity. Margaret was waiting in the car. "Is it done?" she asked. I nodded. "It's done. He's finished." And for the first time in years, I felt like I had finally taken my seat again, not at their table, but at my own. It was almost poetic that the next time we gathered, it was around another table, Christmas dinner, just weeks after the Thanksgiving humiliation. The tree glittered in the corner, ornaments catching the glow of the lights. The scent of roast ham filled the air. But the mood was different, hushed, uneasy. News of Jason's fall had traveled faster than holiday cheer. Family members who had once laughed at his cruel toast now shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding my eyes. Stephanie sat beside Jason, her face pale, her smile brittle. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a month, his suit wrinkled, his hands restless, his voice stripped of the thunder he once wielded. When the meal began, conversation stumbled. No one dared to raise a glass. No one dared to mock. I ate quietly, Margaret at my side, savoring not the food but the silence. For once, it was Jason who squirmed under the weight of it. Halfway through the meal, he tried to speak. "Antonio, about what happened." His voice cracked, the arrogance gone. "We can find a way forward. For the family, for Stephanie." I set down my fork, the sound of metal against porcelain echoing through the room. Every eye turned to me. I didn't rush my words. I had waited too long for this moment to waste it on anger. "You told me I didn't deserve a seat at this table," I said evenly. "But you were wrong. This table was mine long before you ever touched it. And the company you bragged about it was mine too. You just sat in the chair I allowed you." Stephanie's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing. The room stayed silent, the truth hanging heavier than the ornaments on the tree. I rose from my chair, my hands steady, my voice calm. "I don't need apologies. I don't need excuses. I don't even need this table." I looked directly at Jason, his face ashen. "I came tonight for one reason only, to remind you that you can't erase the man who built everything you stand on." Then I placed my napkin down, took Margaret's hand, and walked away. The room remained frozen, their silence now my witness. Jason had once stripped me of dignity in front of them all. Tonight, I had reclaimed it without raising my voice, without lifting a finger. The final confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom or at a lawyer's desk. It happened in the same dining room where Jason once tapped his glass and stripped me of dignity. Life has a way of circling back to the place of greatest humiliation, only this time, the script was mine. It was a Sunday dinner, smaller than before. Fewer faces showed up now that Jason's glow had dimmed. He still tried to play the host, but the weight of failure clung to him. Stephanie hovered at his side, her smile trembling like a candle in the draught. Margaret and I sat quietly, not as guests, not as servants, but as equals reclaiming space. When the plates were cleared and silence settled, I pushed back my chair. Jason's eyes darted to me, fear flickering where arrogance once lived. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I simply stood, steady as the rails I had once walked. "This isn't revenge," I said, my gaze fixed on him. "This is justice served hot, the way you served me humiliation in front of this family. You thought I was just the cook, but I was the one holding the deed to your empire all along." No one laughed this time. No one looked away. Stephanie's tears slid down her cheeks as Jason's face crumpled, the truth pressing him into silence. He had mocked me in front of 3 generations, and now, in the very same room, I had taken everything from him, not with rage, not with cruelty, but with the quiet power of truth. I reached for Margaret's hand. "We're done here," I said softly. Together, we walked out of that house, the weight of decades lifting from my shoulders with each step. Behind me, I left silence thick, suffocating silence, where Jason once demanded laughter. He had taken my dignity for one night. I had taken his kingdom forever, and I didn't look back. The night I walked out of that dining room for the last time, hand in hand with Margaret, I felt lighter than I had in decades. Not because the burden of family had vanished, burdens never disappear so neatly, but because I had finally set it down. The laughter that once cut me had been replaced by silence, and in that silence, I found freedom. We didn't speak much on the drive home. Margaret's hand rested on mine, her thumb tracing circles the way she used to when I came back from long shifts on the rails. After a while, she whispered, "Tony, are you sure this is what you wanted?" I thought about it. Revenge is noisy, messy, a fire that burns everyone around it. But what I had done wasn't revenge. It was justice. It was balance restored. Jason had mocked me in front of 3 generations, turned my daughter against me, and stolen my seat at the table I had built with my own hands. I hadn't screamed. I hadn't struck back in anger. I had simply shown him the truth. Without me, he was nothing. "Yes," I told her finally. "It's what I wanted. More than that, it's what was right." The next morning, I brewed my own coffee and sat on the porch, watching the sun climb over the horizon. For the first time in years, the world didn't feel heavy. No boardroom battles waiting. No dinners where I'd be shoved into the kitchen. No sneers echoing in my ears. Just the quiet hum of a life I had almost forgotten how to enjoy. Jason had lost his empire. Stephanie had lost the illusion that silence was harmless. And me? I had regained something far greater than wealth or recognition. I had regained myself. I leaned back in my chair, the steam from the cup warming my face. Margaret came out and sat beside me, her head resting on my shoulder. We didn't need words. The peace between us said everything. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the provider, the servant, or the invisible man in the kitchen. I was simply Antonio Collins again, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, I noticed the shift. The same relatives who had once laughed at Jason's cruel toast now looked at me with something different in their eyes. Not pity, not guilt. Respect. Quiet, careful respect, the kind born from finally seeing the truth laid bare. My brother-in-law stopped by one afternoon, awkward at first, his hat in his hands. "Tony," he said, "I should have spoken up that night. You didn't deserve that." His words were late, but they carried weight. I nodded, accepting them without bitterness. He had chosen silence then, but at least now he chose honesty. Others followed in small ways. A nephew who had avoided my gaze at the table showed up to help me fix the fence. An old family friend dropped by with a pie, muttering that he never trusted Jason's slick grin. Even neighbors began to treat me differently, no longer as the quiet retiree, but as a man who had stood tall when it mattered. I didn't gloat. I didn't retell the story. I simply listened, nodded, and went about my days. Because true respect doesn't need to be shouted, it lives in the way people carry your name when you're not in the room. Stephanie didn't visit much. When she did, her words were clipped, her eyes tired. I could see the war inside her between the father who had given her everything and the husband who had lost it all. She never apologized. I never asked her to. Some debts can't be paid in words. Margaret noticed it too. "They see you differently now," she whispered one night as we sat by the fire. I shrugged. Maybe, or maybe they're just ashamed. They laughed. But deep inside, I knew it was more than that. They had watched Jason fall, and in his fall, they finally saw me, not the cook, not the servant, not the invisible man in the kitchen. They saw the father, the builder, the man who had never needed a seat at their table to hold the whole house up. Respect had returned, not demanded, not begged for, but earned again in silence and truth. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and Margaret has drifted to sleep beside me, I lie awake and think about the years behind me. The rails, the long shifts, the cold winters, the truck I sold, the retirement I drained, the wedding bills I paid without complaint, the silence I carried like a stone, all of it heavy, all of it costly. And yet, if you asked me whether it was worth it, I would still say yes, because sacrifice, even when forgotten, shapes the ones we love. My daughter may have lost sight of what I gave, but those gifts built her life nonetheless. She had an education, a business, a wedding, all carved out of my back and hands. Whether she honors that or not doesn't change the truth. The weight was real, but so were the moments it bought. The look on her face when she opened her college acceptance letter. the pride in her voice when her first shipment of cosmetics sold out, the sparkle in her eyes as she walked down the aisle. Those were the dividends of sacrifice, even if they paid no respect in return. I don't regret giving. What I regret is believing that giving alone would be enough to hold love steady. Love, it turns out, needs more than sacrifice. It needs respect. It needs recognition. Without those, sacrifice curdles into resentment. But even resentment has its use. It sharpens. It teaches. It reminds you that a man must know his worth even when others forget it. So yes, the wait was worth it. Not because of what it gave them, but because of what it gave me. Endurance, strength, the unshakable knowledge that I did my duty as a father, no matter the cost. And when the day came to set the weight down, to turn sacrifice into justice, I did it without trembling, because I had carried it long enough to know I was strong enough to see it through. There's a different kind of silence in the house now. Not the heavy silence of being dismissed or ignored, but the gentle kind, the kind that feels like peace. I wake up without dread, without the weight of another gathering where I'll be shoved into the kitchen or mocked at the table. I brew my coffee, sit on the porch, and watch the world move without me needing to chase it. For the first time I feel free, truly free. Not because I took Jason down, but because I cut the chains he had wrapped around me, the expectations, the humiliations, the lies that said I was less than what I had built. I see now that I don't need a seat at their table to prove my worth. My worth was in every mile of track I laid, every dollar I sacrificed, every ounce of dignity I reclaimed. Margaret feels it too. She moves lighter, her laughter returning in small bursts, the way it used to when we were young. We plant flowers in the yard together. We walk down the street without worrying about whispers. At night, she leans against me by the fire and says, "This is the life we were meant to have." And I believe her. Stephanie still hasn't come around. Sometimes I wonder if she ever will. But I no longer live waiting for her approval, her apologies, or her recognition. A man cannot chain his heart to those who treat it like scrap. I gave her everything, and she gave me silence. That chapter is written. I will not keep rereading it. Instead, I write new ones. Quiet mornings, shared meals with Margaret, letters from old friends who finally see me for who I am. Respect that isn't begged for, but returned naturally. That is freedom, not wealth, not revenge, not applause. Freedom is the absence of chains. Freedom is walking into tomorrow without dragging yesterday's shame behind you. And for the first time since I can remember, I am walking light. The days have taken on a new rhythm now, one I had almost forgotten could exist. No deadlines, no ledgers, no boardrooms filled with false smiles. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the creak of the porch swing under my weight. In the mornings, Margaret and I tend to the garden. My hands, once rough from iron and steel, now work the soil, coaxing life instead of laying track. Tomatoes, beans, roses, they all answer to patience, not pride. It feels good to build something that doesn't demand, that doesn't betray. Growth without arrogance, that's what I've come to cherish. In the afternoons, we walk through town. People greet us differently now. Not because I own anything, not because I've proven a point, but because they've come to see the truth of who I am. Respect given without conditions is sweeter than any applause Jason ever chased. At night, Margaret and I sit by the fire. Sometimes we talk about the past, but more often, we don't. We sit in the comfort of quiet, letting the crackle of the flames fill the space words used to. Peace doesn't need noise. It needs presence. I even picked up an old hobby again, woodworking. In the shed out back, I shape pieces of oak into chairs and tables. My hands may be slower, but they still remember. Each piece I finish feels like a reminder that creation doesn't need recognition to matter. It's enough that it exists, sturdy and honest, unlike the hollow empire Jason built. This life isn't glamorous. It won't make the papers or earn applause. But it's mine. Mine and Margaret's. Built on the kind of work that doesn't fade with scandal or collapse under arrogance. Jason may still chase shadows. Stephanie may still wrestle with silence. But their choices no longer bind me. My life is no longer defined by the seat they tried to take from me. Now, I sit at a different table, the one I built with my own hands, in my own home, with peace as my only guest of honor. It arrived on a gray morning, slipped through the slot with the rest of the mail. Margaret placed it on the kitchen table beside my coffee. The envelope was cream-colored, the handwriting familiar enough to stop my breath for a moment. Stephanie's. I stared at it for a long time. My name written by the same hand that once drew Father's Day cards in crayon. the same hand that had clung to mine when she was small, but the weight of those years pressed against the paper, heavier than any words it might contain. Margaret sipped her tea quietly, watching me. "Aren't you going to open it?" she asked gently. I shook my head. "No." She tilted her head. "Don't you want to know what she has to say?" I looked at the envelope again. Maybe it was an apology. Maybe it was an excuse. Maybe it was nothing but silence, dressed in ink. But I realized I didn't need to know. My peace didn't hinge on her words anymore. Forgiveness is not always healing. Sometimes it is a chain disguised as mercy. "I don't need her to explain," I said. "I don't need her to justify. I gave her my life already. Whatever she writes now can't change that." Margaret reached across the table, resting her hand on mine. No judgment, no pressure, just presence. Together, we sat there, the envelope untouched between us. Later, I placed it in the drawer, alongside other papers that told stories of sacrifice and betrayal. But unlike those, this one would remain sealed, because not every story needs to be read, and not every wound needs reopening. Some might call it cold. I call it survival. A man cannot walk into freedom while dragging behind the echoes of betrayal. The letter remains unopened to this day, and that too is an answer. The older I get, the more I understand that freedom isn't about what you gain, it's about what you leave behind. I left behind the table where I was mocked, the silence that betrayed me, the illusions that sacrifice alone could guarantee love, and I haven't once turned to look over my shoulder. Margaret and I live simply now. Our days are stitched together with small joys, her laughter in the garden, the smell of bread rising in the oven, the soft creak of the porch swing as the sun sets. It isn't grand, it isn't flashy, but it's real. And after a lifetime of being invisible, real is more than enough. Sometimes I see Jason's name in the papers, usually in whispers about debts unpaid or ventures failed. Stephanie's face appears on social media from time to time, smiling through a life built on cracks. But they are just names and faces now, no longer anchors on my heart. I don't hate them, I don't forgive them, I simply don't carry them anymore. People ask me if I regretted taking back what was mine, leaving my daughter to face the ruin of her husband's pride. My answer is always the same. Regret belongs to those who act in anger. I acted in truth. Truth may wound, but it also cleanses. It sets a man free. The last time I walked past that old dining room, the candles flickering on the table, I realized something. Dignity cannot be given or taken. It must be claimed. Jason tried to strip me of it. Stephanie let him. But I reclaimed it, not with noise or violence, but with silence sharpened into steel. Now, when I close my eyes at night, I don't see the smirk on Jason's face, or the silence in Stephanie's. I see the tracks I laid, the garden I tend, the woman still at my side. I see a man who gave everything, lost almost all of it, and yet stands taller in the end. I walk forward without forgiveness, without bitterness, without chains, and I will never look back.